All right, today we're going to talk about how much money do venture capitalists make. You may have seen pictures of them or videos of them going around on exotic locations, driving their Teslas, and just assume that they're all fabulously wealthy. And certainly some are very wealthy. So you've got people like Mike Moritz and John Doerr and Vinod Khosla and Peter Thiel, all billionaires from investments in companies like Facebook and Google and a whole bunch more. But that's not all of them, right? Not all VCs make that much money. Today we're going to talk about how venture capitalists make money. So where do those funds flow from, and then how do those funds flow to the various people at the firm? And that stay to the end, because what we're going to talk about and what you'll find out through this process is that not all VCs are rich. In fact, odds are they're not nearly as wealthy as you think they are. So let's dive in. So the first thing we have to understand is how venture capitalists make money. If you look at the typical venture fund, they are making money in two ways. So the first one is called management fee. And the management fee is paid by the investors to the fund. Typically, it's about 2%. It can range from kind of the low of 1% all the way up to 3%, but most funds are right at about 2% management fee. And this management fee, this 2%, is paid every year based on the total assets of the fund. So if I have a $100 million fund, then every year I'm getting paid $2 million in management fee. Now, there are some variations in this. It could be based on the total assets that you have. It could be based on the total assets that you've deployed and the total investments you've made. But either way, it's usually applied to the total amount of capital that you have to invest. So that's management fee. The other way that VCs get compensated is through carry. Now, carry is a performance fee, and this is based on the performance of the fund. So let's say I have that same $100 million fund, and I'm charging 20% carry, which is the industry standard. Again, this can fluctuate between 10 and 30%, but most funds are about 20%. If I have a $100 million fund and I invest that capital and I do really well and I turn it into $300 million of total value, right? So I invest that $100 million into lots of different companies. Those companies do well and they end up sending back $300 million. Well, the first thing I do is I'm going to pay off that $100 million that I had taken from my investors to invest. That leaves me with a profit of $200 million. And this $200 million is then split 80-20. So 20% goes to the VCs. So that's $40 million. And the remaining $160 million goes to my LPs, my investors in the fund. So on a typical fund, this VC, let's say they make 2% over the life of the fund. So that's going to be $20 million over 10 years, because most funds are about 10 years. And then they're also going to get another $40 million of carry. So total comp of $60 million, assuming that they have a 3x fund. Now, if they do better than that, it could be a lot higher. If they do worse, it could be a lot lower. So it just depends on kind of fund size and performance. Okay, so this is the total comp that can be paid to the fund. Now we have to think about like who gets that money. Okay, so at a typical venture fund, you're going to have several different people. So you'll have the general partners or managing directors of the fund. And if you have a fund that's about 100 million, just to keep our example going, you'll probably have somewhere between 1 to 3 of those people. Then they'll have typically a VP and an associate or an analyst. They'll have support staff, so this could be a CFO. Although a $100 million fund is pretty small, so maybe they don't have a CFO, and then they'll have an executive assistant. And then they also have all the other operating expenses of the fund. So if your typical fund has, these individuals are probably making, associates and analysts are probably making about $100K per year. VPs are making somewhere between 100 to 200,000 per year. And support staff is probably about 75K all in. And then you have all of your operating expenses. So this is rent, travel, all of that other stuff that has to go into it. And, having looked at a bunch of different funds and budgets, that's probably somewhere around the range of 400K per year to spend on rent, travel, benefits, all of those different things. So what that leaves you with then is somewhere around 775K per year of operating expenses. Now, we said earlier that you're charging 2% of 100 million, which means you're getting $2 million per year. If we then subtract that out, so that's going to leave us roughly $1.2 million. That's then going to get split up among our 3 GPs. So each one of them is going to make about 400K per year. So that's pretty good, right? That's not bad. Now, if they have higher operating expenses or they have a couple VPs or a couple analysts, these numbers from the GP could go down. I saw a recent report that said that most GPs, managing directors and partners, are making about 300K. That would make sense, especially if you have a slightly smaller fund or what have you. Okay, so your typical MD or partner at a fund, is going to probably be making somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. That's pretty good, right? Not bad. Not millionaire status, but getting there in that direction, and definitely not billionaire status. All right. So this is all the management fee. Let's talk about the carry piece. Now, carry does not get split up in the same way that management fee does. How does carry get split up within the fund? Now, remember, this is 20% of $100 million fund. Now, your typical fund is targeting about a 3x return. So that's that 300 million. And if we assume 20% carry, that means there's going to be 200 million in profit, and 20% of that 200 million is going to be $40 million, right? Okay. So if our fund has 1 to 3 GPs, now the GPs are the general partners, and they're the ones that are usually getting the carry. So 40 million is going to be split between 1 to 3 people. So that could be somewhere between, call it, 15 to $25 million going back to the GPs. Now that's a really good day, right? If you can put that much money in your pocket. Occasionally, you'll also have VPs and principals that will make some carry as well. It's not as much typically. So, whereas a GP, they may be getting somewhere, in this case, call it 30 to 100% of the carry. A principal's probably getting somewhere closer to like 1 to 5% of the carry. So in their case, they're going to get 400K. All right. So if you're a GP in a fund, you're going to make that 400K, we'll call it, we'll just be generous, times 10 years. So that's $4 million. And then you're also going to, if you have this successful fund, you're going to make, 1/3 of 40. So that's going to be an additional, call it 13 million. So total comp, $17 million. Okay, well, that's pretty good, right? Like, I would say most people that make $17 million are rich, right? They're definitely in the 1% of the 1%. You also have to take into consideration time, because a venture fund is a 10-year vehicle. And during those 10 years, you're drawing your management fee, right? So as a GP, your comp, right? You're getting that 400K every year over 10 years. So that's coming in. But that big slog of capital, that $13 million that we talked about, you don't get that typically until year 10 and sometimes even later. So right off the bat, and the reason for that is because what happens is you make all these investments, right? So I make an investment in company A and company B and company C and company D and so forth over time. And then over time, like company A fails, company B gets acquired for like 1 times your investments. You don't make any money on that. Company C does, maybe they generate like a 3x return and so on and so forth. And you're really hoping for like one of those companies to go really big and end up returning your whole fund and maybe then some. But those companies, they often take longer than 10 years to exit. So VC is getting paid pretty well during that time period, but they haven't really achieved true wealth. Now, the other thing that you have to keep in mind is this idea of power law distribution. So we've talked about this in other videos, But basically, what this power law distribution says is that the returns are not evenly spread out, nor are they spread out where like most of the returns are centered in the middle and then you have outliers on either side. The reality is that most deals lose money and that there are a few deals that make up the bulk of the returns. Well, what this also means is that it carries all the way through to venture funds. And in fact, the Kauffman Foundation, which does a lot of research around venture capital, came out and showed that something like 60% of venture funds don't return more money than that money would have generated in the S&P 500 if they just left it in the public markets. And so you have a lot of funds, maybe upwards of 40 to 50% of funds that never get a carry check. And so this is one of those like dirty secrets that when you look at venture capitalists, yeah, there are a few that are making billions of dollars on their investments, but the majority potentially aren't even getting their carry check. They're just getting this management fee. But don't get me wrong, we shouldn't feel bad for VCs, right? Making $300,000 to $400,000 a year is great. I just wouldn't categorize them as being fabulously wealthy, living on yachts and hobnobbing all over the world. So if you liked this, if this was helpful, check out my next video where we're going to talk about what it's like to work in private equity.